Is she out of her mind? That was the first thing I heard before I ran into the collapsing garage, smoke pouring out from under the door like the building itself was exhaling. Someone grabbed my collar and yanked me backward. Someone else was screaming that the propane tanks inside were going to go. Phones were already up, recording a gray-haired man in a rumpled funeral suit sprinting toward a burning building, and at that moment I didn't care whether I walked back out of it. The bitter joke was that 4 hours earlier, all I had wanted was a ride home from the airport. I had just buried my son, Michael, 29 years old. A drunk driver on the interstate had taken him from me in March, and it had taken the courts 5 months to finish grinding through what was left of the case before they'd release him for burial. I flew to Ohio for the service, stood over that casket alone, and flew back to Charlotte that same night because I couldn't stand one more hour in a state that only reminded me of what I'd lost. From the plane, I texted my daughter, Claire, and my son-in-law, Trent. Landing at 6:40. Any chance one of you could grab me? Claire wrote back 40 minutes later. We've got a school thing for the twins tonight, Dad. Can't you just get a cab? Trent added underneath it. Yeah, sorry, bad timing. I looked at that message for a long time before I answered. Then I typed 2 words. No problem. I put my phone face down on the tray table and stared out at the clouds until we landed. 4 hours after that, half the state knew my name from a video of a 63-year-old man in a black suit climbing through a collapsed garage doorway to pull a family out from under a roof that was actively coming down. By the next morning, over 2 million people had watched it. Only my daughter still didn't know it was me. The first she heard of it came from her neighbor, banging on her door at 7 in the morning, phone held up, screaming that she needed to see this. My name is Walter Higgins. I'm 63 years old. And until the day I retired from the Charlotte Fire Department 11 years ago, I spent 31 years walking into buildings other people were running out of. I made captain in my last decade on the job. I trained men half my age to do things that terrified them, and I told every single one of them the same thing before their first real fire. Fear is just information, not an instruction. My wife, Sandra, died 6 years ago, breast cancer, and after that it was just me and my 2 kids, Claire and Michael. Though by then they were both grown with their own lives, their own kids, their own noise. Michael had struggled for years, in and out of work, in and out of relationships, but 18 months before he died he'd gotten sober, gotten a job doing HVAC repair, and started calling me every Sunday just to talk, not because he needed anything, just because he wanted to. Those calls were the best hour of my week. I used to tell him I was proud of him and he'd get embarrassed and change the subject, but I could hear it landing somewhere in him every time. Claire was different. Claire had always been the capable one, the one who didn't need reminding, who built a life that looked complete from the outside, a husband, 2 kids, a house and a good school district. Sandra used to say Claire loved hard, but showed it through logistics, through schedules and casseroles, never through the soft stuff. I told myself that was just her way. I didn't know yet how much that habit was going to cost all of us. The morning of the accident, a driver high on something crossed the center line on Route 9 outside Dayton and hit Michael's truck head-on, doing 71 miles an hour. He didn't suffer, the coroner told me, which is the kind of sentence you're supposed to find comforting and never do. I flew out for the arraignment hearings twice that spring, sat in the back of a courtroom watching a 24-year-old kid with a public defender avoid looking at me, and then I flew out a 3rd time in August because the medical examiner's office had finally released Michael's body for burial. 5 months my son sat in a drawer in a government building while lawyers argued about evidence chains. 5 months I couldn't put him in the ground. The funeral itself was small. Michael didn't have many friends left from his, using years, and the sober ones he'd made in the last 18 months hadn't known him long enough to fly across 3 states for it. It was me, his sponsor Kenny, and a scattering of cousins who'd driven up from Kentucky. No church, because Michael hadn't been inside one since he was 12, just a funeral home chapel and a playlist of Johnny Cash songs he used to blast in that truck of his. I stood at the graveside until the funeral director cleared his throat and told me they needed to close up. I told him I understood. I did not understand anything. I flew back to Charlotte that same evening because staying in Ohio one more night felt like it might actually kill me. Sandra used to squeeze my hand during takeoff and whisper that I owed her a milkshake if we made it down safe. This time, the seat beside me held nothing but my suit jacket, folded the way she taught me, and I spent the whole flight looking at it instead of out the window. We landed a little after 6:30. I sat in my seat while the rest of the cabin filed out around me, because nobody was waiting on the other side of security for me, and there was no reason to hurry toward an empty curb. I opened my phone in the jet bridge and typed to the family group thread, the one with me, Claire, Trent, and my 2 grandkids' school photos as the header image. Landing now. Any chance one of you could grab me from the airport? I sent it and put the phone away, because I've never liked asking my own children for things, not once in 63 years, and some part of me was embarrassed even as I typed it. Claire's answer came while I was still walking down the jet bridge. "We've got a school thing for the twins tonight, Dad. Can't you just get a cab?" I stood there in the crowd of people moving around me and read it twice. Trent's followed a minute later. "Yeah, sorry. Bad timing on our end. Bad timing." I had just left my son in the ground 400 miles away, and flown home alone to an empty house that still had his childhood bedroom in it, and the timing was bad for them. I could have told them where I'd been. I could have said, "I just buried your brother, and all I wanted tonight was one familiar face waiting for me instead of a stranger with a name tag." Instead, I typed, "No problem," and I meant it the way you mean it when you've simply stopped expecting anything different. I picked up my one bag from baggage claim, my suit jacket over my arm because I hadn't bothered to put it back on, and walked out into a warm Carolina evening that smelled like jet fuel and cut grass. Families were hugging at the curb around me, horns going, life proceeding exactly the way it always does, entirely uninterested in the fact that mine had just been cracked open again. I was 3 blocks from the terminal, walking toward the long-term parking garage where I kept my truck, when I heard the first crack, sharp and wrong, followed by a sound like a building exhaling all its air at once. I turned and saw black smoke pouring out from under the roll-up door of a 2-story auto repair garage that backed up against the parking structure. A woman was screaming on the sidewalk, pointing at the 2nd floor, where there was an apartment over the shop, and I could see a man in the window up there, pounding on glass that wouldn't open. 2 kids were with him. I could see their faces, even from that distance, the particular kind of stillness that comes right before real panic. Somebody near me said the fire department was 6, maybe 8 minutes out because of traffic on the interstate coming off the accident that had already backed everything up for miles. 8 minutes. I knew exactly how long 8 minutes is inside a structure fire, because I'd spent 31 years learning it in my body instead of my head. 8 minutes is the difference between a rescue and a recovery. I didn't decide to run toward that building. My legs just started moving before the rest of me caught up, the same way they had 100 times on the job, and somewhere behind me a woman screamed that I shouldn't go in there, that it might collapse. Maybe. Maybe not. That family upstairs didn't have time to wait and find out which. I want to be honest about something here, because I think it's the part people skip past too fast when they imagine themselves being brave. It wasn't bravery. Bravery would have required a choice, a weighing of risk against reward, and there was no room in my head for that kind of arithmetic. There was only the fact that a man and 2 children were trapped above a fire, and I had 31 years of training that didn't care that I was 63 years old in dress shoes and a wrinkled funeral suit, and there was a part of me, the part still standing over a grave in Ohio, that simply did not have room left to be afraid of dying. I found the side door, kicked it twice before the frame gave, and the heat hit me like a wall the moment it opened. Black smoke rolling along the ceiling the way it does when a fire's been building unseen for longer than anyone realized. I dropped low, the way you train men to do for 31 years, and hope they remember it when it counts, and felt my way along a workbench toward the interior stairwell I'd clocked from outside. My hands found the railing. My lungs were already burning. Somewhere above me, I could hear the man screaming for his kids to stay low, stay together, and I followed the sound of his voice up through smoke thick enough to chew. The stairwell door at the top was warm but not scorching, which told me the fire hadn't fully reached that side of the building yet, and when I got it open, I found him kneeling with both kids pressed against him, a boy, maybe 8, and a girl no older than 5, both coughing, both terrified, their father's arms wrapped around them like he thought that alone might stop smoke from reaching their lungs. I told him my name was Walter, told him I used to do this for a living, and told him we were going down the way I'd come, low and fast, hands on shoulders, don't let go of each other for any reason. The little girl wouldn't move. Her father tried to lift her, and she went rigid with fear the way children do, and I got down on my knees in front of her, right there with smoke curling along the ceiling 8 feet above us, and told her that my granddaughter's name was Emma too, which was a lie. I didn't even know her name yet, but I said it because sometimes in that moment what a person needs isn't the truth. It's a reason to trust the hand reaching for theirs. She let me pick her up. I carried her down that stairwell with her face buried in my shoulder while her father carried the boy behind me, and by the time we came out the side door into daylight, the first fire engine was just turning onto the block, 6 minutes behind where I'd needed it to be. Someone wrapped a blanket around the girl. Someone else was shouting for a medic, even though none of us needed one yet, just air and a minute to remember how to breathe it. I sat down hard on the curb because my legs had finally decided to stop pretending they were 40 years younger than they were, and that's when I noticed my hands, both palms scraped raw from the stairwell railing, my dress shirt scorched black along one forearm, and a cut above my eyebrow I didn't remember getting and wouldn't feel for another hour. A firefighter I didn't recognize, younger than my own son would have been, crouched down next to me and asked if I was hurt. I told him I'd had worse, and he laughed the particular laugh you save for old men who say things like that, and then he asked my name for his report. Walter Higgins, I told him. Retired 31 years out of Station 4. His face changed completely. He said his captain used to talk about a Higgins who trained half the department in the 90s. I told him that captain was being generous. Somebody's phone had been recording since before I even reached the door, and it turned out 3 or 4 more had picked it up once I came out carrying that little girl, and all of that had already started moving through the internet before the ambulance even finished checking my vitals, because that's how it works now, whether you want it to or not. A paramedic cleaned the cuts on my hands and asked if there was family she could call to come get me. I told her my daughter had a school thing that night. She looked at me for a second too long, the way people do when a sentence doesn't quite add up, and then she just nodded and handed me a bottle of water and told me somebody should be looking after me tonight regardless. So did I told her, though not out loud. A reporter found me maybe 20 minutes later, a woman named Renata Cole with a cameraman a few steps behind her, and she asked if I'd answer a couple of questions. I told her I really wasn't in the mood. She said witnesses were telling her I'd gone back toward the building a second time to check for anyone else before the fire department arrived, which was true. There'd been a car in the garage bay I needed to be sure was empty, and she said the family I'd carried out wanted to thank whoever I was. I told her I was glad they were safe, and that was really all I wanted to say. She nodded, and, unlike most of them, she actually let it go. I remember thinking there might still be 1 or 2 decent ones left in that business. Because the street was closed off for the fire investigation, an officer offered to drive me the rest of the way to my truck, and from there I drove myself to a motel 2 exits down instead of home, because I couldn't yet face walking into a house with Michael's old bedroom door still closed at the end of the hall, still exactly the way I'd left it that morning before my flight to Ohio. I checked into a room with a mustard-colored bedspread and sat on the edge of the bed holding my ruined suit jacket, the one Sandra had picked out for me years ago for occasions just like the one I'd worn it to that day, and that's when I finally broke. Not for the fire, not for my hands. For the fact that there would never be another Sunday call from Michael, telling me about some job he'd finished, asking if I'd eaten dinner yet, saying he was proud of himself and waiting, always waiting, for me to say it back first. Across town, Claire was helping the twins into their soccer uniforms when her phone started buzzing. First a neighbor, then a coworker, then her book club group chat, all of them sending the same 12-second clip. Trent found her standing frozen in the kitchen, phone in her hand, face gone white. "Is that your dad?" he asked, already knowing the answer before she could say it. Her friend Marisol called next, breathless, saying she'd just seen him on Channel 9, asking if Claire had known, and Claire had to sit down at her own kitchen table because the answer was no. She hadn't known anything. She'd been so buried in carpool logistics and twins' cleats that she hadn't spared a single thought that afternoon for what her father's flight home from burying his son must have felt like. The station ran a chyron a few minutes later, identifying him as a retired Charlotte firefighter who'd flown in that evening from his son's funeral in Ohio, and Claire had to read it 3 times before the words arranged themselves into something she could understand. Her son had missed a soccer game he never even noticed missing, and her father had walked alone into a burning building 4 hours after burying his boy, and she had told him to get a cab. I woke a little after 5 the next morning, and for a few merciful seconds I forgot everything. Forgot I was in a motel and not my own bed. Forgot Michael was gone. I forgot the smoke in the stairwell and my scorched jacket hanging over the bathroom door. Then it all landed at once, the way it does every single morning now. A fresh weight dropped from a height I never see coming. I didn't turn on the television. I'd spent 31 years walking into disasters and slipping back out before anyone could make a fuss over it, and recognition had never once been the reason I did any of it. Around 8, there was a knock at the door. It was Renata, the reporter, looking almost sheepish, standing there. She said the motel clerk had recognized me from the footage, and she wasn't there to push a camera in my face again. She just wanted me to know that the family I'd carried out, the Ferraro family, had asked the department to help track down who I was so they could thank me properly, and that the little girl, whose name actually was Ellie, kept asking her father about the man who said his granddaughter had the same name as her. I laughed for the first time since the graveside in Ohio. Told Renata I hoped somebody was also teaching that little girl not to climb toward smoke herself. She smiled and told me there were a dozen reporters already camped near the fire station hoping to catch me. I asked her to keep my location between us. She gave me her word, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I believed a stranger's promise more than I trusted my own family's. Meanwhile, Claire and Trent had driven to my house that morning using the spare key I kept in the fake rock by the porch steps, and everything sat exactly as I'd left it before flying out to Ohio. My recliner angled toward the window, my work boots by the back door, the coffee maker still holding yesterday's grounds because I hadn't had the heart to deal with it before my flight. Claire stood in the hallway outside Michael's old bedroom for a long moment before she finally pushed the door open, something she hadn't done in years, and found it exactly the way he'd left it as a teenager: band posters, a dresser with his old baseball trophies, and on the nightstand, a stack of spiral notebooks she'd never noticed before. Michael had kept a journal the last 18 months of his life, through his sobriety, and Claire sat down on his old bed and began to read. And Trent stood in the doorway and watched his wife's shoulders start to shake before she'd even finished the first page. Michael had written about our Sunday calls. He'd written that his father was the only person who never once made him feel like a disappointment even during the worst years, that I'd quietly paid off a collections debt from his using days, without ever mentioning it to him, that I'd told him I was proud of him every single week, and he still hadn't figured out how to say it back without his voice cracking. Claire turned another page and found an entry from 4 months before the accident. Michael writing that he was scared to tell Claire how much their distance had hurt him over the years, how she used to be the one who called, back when they were kids, and somewhere in adulthood the calls had just stopped, and he didn't know how to bring it up without sounding like he was keeping score. I didn't know he felt that way, Claire said out loud, to no one, because Trent had gone quiet behind her. She kept reading. An entry about their mother's illness, how Michael had struggled to be there because addiction had its hooks in him during those years, and how I'd never once thrown that back at him, had just kept showing up at every hospital visit and never made him feel smaller for the ones he'd missed. An entry from just 2 weeks before the crash, Michael writing that he'd finally saved enough to take his dad on a real fishing trip that summer, someplace up in the mountains, because he wanted, just once, to be the one doing something for me, instead of the other way around. Claire put the notebook down and sat very still. He was planning something for Dad, she said, and I told Dad to get a cab the day we buried him. Trent's phone rang around noon. It was his boss, of all people, saying the whole office had seen the footage and wanted to know if that was really his father-in-law, and Trent had to explain, voice unsteady, that yes, it was, and no, he hadn't known his father-in-law was even flying home that night, and no, he still hadn't called to check on him. He hung up and looked at his wife, still sitting on her dead brother's bed with a notebook open in her lap, and said the thing neither of them had said out loud yet. We told him to grab a cab. The day he buried Michael, we told him to grab a cab. Claire didn't answer. She was looking at a photograph tucked into the back pages of the notebook, one of me and Michael from years earlier, both of us sunburned and grinning beside a lake, an old fishing trip from when he was maybe 15, before things got hard for him, before the years neither of us liked to talk about. On the back, in Michael's handwriting, just one line. Best day I can remember. Want to give Dad another one before it's too late. I sat alone that afternoon on a bench near the Catawba River, the same spot Sandra used to bring the kids for picnics decades ago, back when Claire still called just to talk, and Michael was still small enough to ride on my shoulders. My phone rang. Claire's name on the screen. I let it ring twice before I answered. Not out of spite, just because some part of me needed those 2 extra seconds to decide whether I was ready. She didn't say hello. She just said my name, and then she couldn't say anything else for a long moment, and I could hear Trent's voice in the background telling her it was okay, take her time. "Dad," she finally managed, "please come home. Please." 4 words I'd wanted to hear the night before, arriving about 18 hours too late to feel the way they should have. I didn't yell at her. I didn't ask what had changed her mind, though I already knew, because Renata had mentioned on her way out that morning that the story everyone was fixating on wasn't the fire, it was the detail that I'd flown home alone for my son's funeral to an empty curb. I told Claire I wasn't ready yet, and I ended the call, not to punish her, but because some wounds need room to breathe a while before they can hold forgiveness without splitting back open under the weight of it. I spent the rest of that afternoon walking along the river, watching kayakers paddle past, watching a father teach his son to skip stones near the bank, ordinary Tuesday things happening around me while I stood inside a version of the day that felt anything but ordinary. Renata called again that evening, not for an interview this time, she said, just to relay that the fire chief wanted to give me a formal commendation and the Ferraro family wanted to meet me properly, and a local news director was already talking about a follow-up segment calling me a hero who ran into a fire hours after burying his own son. I told her I wasn't interested in any of that. She said she understood, but there was one more thing. She wanted to make sure the story got told accurately, because 2 different stations were already speculating about why I'd been alone at that airport, with no one to pick me up. "They don't need to know the details," I said. "I think they might need to hear them," she said. "Loneliness like that isn't rare, Walter. A lot of people watching are going to recognize themselves in it." Then she told me, quietly, that her own mother had passed in a care facility during a bad stretch a few years back, and that Renata had been 3 states away at the time and hadn't made it back before the end, and that she still hadn't fully forgiven herself for it. Neither of us said anything for a while after that. I agreed to one interview. No dramatic music, no leading questions about my daughter, and if I didn't want to answer something, I wasn't going to. She agreed to all of it. We filmed the next morning in a small conference room at the fire station. Just 2 chairs and 1 camera, no crowd. She asked why I'd run toward that building instead of waiting for the trucks. I told her that, after 31 years and after burying a son, fear stops carrying the weight it used to, and you stop asking whether something's dangerous, and start asking only whether somebody up there needs you more than you need to be safe. Then she asked the question I'd known was coming from the moment she walked in. Had my family known I was flying home alone that night, straight from my son's funeral? I had every reason to tell the truth sitting in that chair. I could have let 2 million people understand exactly what my daughter had said to me on the worst day of my life. Instead I said, "They've got young kids and a full house. It's a lot to manage." I told her Claire and Trent were juggling more than I had to at their age, raising 2 little ones, working full-time, and that, of course, a last-minute pickup was hard to swing. Renata studied me for a moment, the kind of look that tells you someone knows exactly what you're doing and is deciding whether to let you do it. "You don't sound angry," she said. "I've used up all my anger this year already," I told her. Didn't have room left to spend any more of it on this. That single line ended up being the one clip that outran everything else, more than the fire, more than the girl I'd carried out. Because something about an old man saying he'd run out of anger to spare hit close enough to home for enough people that it started showing up captioned on every platform within a day. Claire watched the segment alone in her car in a grocery store parking lot, unable to make herself go inside afterward. Trent watched it on his phone during his lunch break and had to walk out to the parking garage stairwell so nobody at the office would see him cry. Their older twin Grace found the clip on her own phone that evening, having heard kids at school talking about it, and asked her mother, with the particular bluntness only an 8-year-old has, why Grandpa was making excuses for people who'd been mean to him. Claire didn't have an answer. Most adults wouldn't have either. That night, my porch filled up quietly with things I never asked for. A casserole dish from a neighbor I could barely place. A card from someone at the fire department I hadn't spoken to in years. Somebody had mowed my lawn without ringing the bell, and somebody else had left flowers on the front step with no name attached at all, just a note that said thank you for pulling that family out. Nobody made a production of it. They just quietly did what apparently I'd spent 31 years doing for this city without anybody keeping score. When I finally drove home that evening, 2 lawn chairs sat waiting on my porch, Claire in one, Trent in the other, both of them without their phones in hand for what might have been the first time in years. Neither of us moved for a long moment once I stepped out of the truck. I want to slow down here, because this is the part that actually mattered more than any fire ever could. Claire stood up first and walked down the steps and asked if she could carry my bag inside, and it struck me that the last time she'd carried anything of mine, she'd been about 10 years old and insisting she was strong enough to help with the groceries. Trent said he'd made coffee, though it turned out he'd used the wrong kind of filter and it came out thin as tea, and somehow that was the first thing all three of us laughed about since Michael died. A stupid, small thing, but real. Inside, the kitchen counter was buried under casserole dishes and cards from people I barely remembered meeting over the years. Claire finally admitted they'd found Michael's journals. I told her I'd known that day would come eventually, that I'd never once thought about hiding them from her. She asked if I'd let her read what he wrote about her, about the fishing trip he'd been planning, about missing the years when she used to call just to talk. I told her every word of it was true, and none of it was said to hurt her. It was just Michael, finally getting honest on paper, the way he never quite managed to out loud. We sat at the same kitchen table where Sandra used to referee Thanksgiving arguments for 25 years, no television on, no phones out, just three people finally willing to say the hard things instead of texting around them. Claire asked why I never told her about paying off Michael's old debts. I told her that helping him wasn't supposed to become a story, it was supposed to just be help. Trent asked, quietly, why I hadn't told the truth on camera about the airport, why I hadn't let 2 million strangers understand exactly what they'd said to me. I told him that shaming somebody in front of an audience doesn't heal what's actually broken between two people. It just gives everyone else something to feel superior about for an afternoon, and Sandra never once believed in that kind of accountability. It should lead somewhere, I told him, the way she used to say it. Not just leave people flattened on the other side of it. Claire asked if I'd been angry that night at the airport. I told her of course I had. She said I hadn't sounded angry on camera at all. I told her 31 years on that job teaches you that speaking while you're still furious just hands you a second mess to clean up once you've calmed down. A few days later, the three of us drove out to the small cemetery outside Dayton where Michael was buried, a trip Claire insisted on making even though it meant taking the twins out of school for 2 days. She'd never actually seen his grave. Standing there, she read the headstone twice, like she needed to make it real by reading it a second time, and then she sat down right in the grass beside it and told her brother she was sorry, for the years of distance, for the phone calls that stopped, for not being there at the end the way he'd once been there for her. Trent put a hand on her shoulder and didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything useful to say. I told them both that most of raising kids is teaching them how to walk, and the hardest lesson left over, the one nobody prepares you for, is teaching them how to walk back toward each other, once life's pulled them apart. Claire broke down completely then, and it wasn't the quick, dutiful hug my daughter usually gave me at holidays out of habit. It was the kind of hug a frightened kid gives when she finally understands exactly how close she came to losing the other person still holding her whole family together. In the weeks after that, Claire started calling on Sunday evenings, the same night Michael used to call, though neither of us ever said that part out loud. Trent started showing up on Saturday mornings with coffee, and no particular reason given, just because. My grandson, Grace's twin brother Sam, wandered into my garage one afternoon and asked if I'd teach him to fix something, anything, and we spent 3 hours rebuilding an old bicycle that had been sitting untouched in my shed since Michael was a teenager. And when Sam finally got it running, he looked prouder than I'd seen a kid look in a long while. A month later, the fire department asked me to speak at a retirement send-off for younger firefighters, and I almost said no the way I'd said no to everything since the funeral. Then I remembered something Michael wrote in that last journal entry Claire had shown me, that if your worst year could still be useful to somebody else, it stopped being just your own bad year. So I said yes. Near the end of that talk, somebody in the crowd, a young probationary firefighter, asked me what made me run into that building the day I did of all days. I told them the truth, that my son had spent his last 18 months teaching me that showing up for the people you love isn't optional and it isn't convenient. It's just something you do, and that once you understand that all the way down, you stop being able to walk past somebody who needs you, even when you've got every excuse in the world to keep walking. The mistake most families make isn't one big betrayal. It's 100 small postponements, an unanswered call, a missed Sunday, the quiet, dangerous assumption that there's always going to be another chance to make it right. Sometimes there isn't. If there's one thing I'd ask you to actually do tonight, not just nod along to, it's this. Call your mother, call your father, call whoever it is you've been meaning to call and kept putting off because life got busy and there was always going to be a next weekend. Ask yourself honestly whether there's somebody in your life you've quietly assumed will simply always be there when you finally get around to it. Because I promise you from the bottom of everything I've got left, that assumption is the most dangerous one any of us ever make. I'd love to hear from you tonight, however you're related to whoever's listening beside you right now. Wife, husband, son, daughter, grandkid, doesn't matter. Tell me where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you're sitting, because it still amazes me, all these months later, how many different corners of the country end up sharing this same quiet hour with me. And if any part of tonight's story pulled at something in your own family, I'd love to hear that too. If this one meant something to you, stay a little longer and consider subscribing, because I've got more stories like this about the quiet things we carry for each other and don't notice until it's almost too late to say so. Until next time, take care of the people who are still answering when you call, and don't wait for a headline to remind you who's been carrying you all along.